chess players. My name is Chris Torres, and this is my daily chess musing for Wednesday, November 24th, 2021. It's common knowledge that childhood memories influence us as grown-ups, and every chess player I know has experienced a loss that haunts them. Put the two together, and it's easy to imagine how these early painful losses can create an emotional Achilles heel that may leave a chess player vulnerable to their childhood nemesis as an adult. This is why the 2021 FIDE World Chess Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi is such an intriguing matchup. Early in his career, a young Magnus Carlsen, who had grown accustomed to the belief that he was the best chess player his age in the world, was soundly outplayed by Ian Nepomniachtchi. Now, 19 years later, the world champion must face his childhood nemesis on chess's biggest stage, thereby continuing the tradition these two generational phenoms began decades in the past when Ian prevailed. So, for today's video, on the eve of the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match, I thought it fitting to show the game that started the remarkable rivalry between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi. So for our feature game today, we are going back to October of 2002 to take a look at the game played between Ian Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen during the European Youth Chess Championship. Ian begins with e4, and Magnus plays knight f6, Alekhines defense. I don't think there's an opening that Carlsen hasn't tried. e5, gaining space against the knight, knight d5, knight f3, d6, and 4d4. This is the modern variation. White has several other fourth move options, including pawn to c4, bishop c4, and even exd6. But rather than turn this into an opening lesson on the Alekhines defense, I think we'll stick to the game at this juncture. Carlsen plays 4dx e5, 5 knight takes e5. Black's fifth move is g6, preparing a fianchetto, and Ian plays 6 bishop c4, which certainly makes a lot of sense given the bishop and knight are both targeting the weak f7 square. However, last year, Ian also played 6 queen to f3 at this point in a game that he lost to Jeffrey Zhang during the St. Louis Rapid. You can see that game in my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. So Ian plays 6 bishop c4, and Magnus responds by supporting his knight with c6. More recently, Carlsen has preferred playing 6 bishop e6 to support the knight, with play continuing 7 castle, knight d7, rook e1, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop g7, rook e1, and castling. In the game between Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen, played in the Banter Blitz final on September 29th, 2020. Again, if you want to see that game, it is contained in my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. But back in 2002, Magnus Carlsen preferred to play 6c6. But e6, and as I've already shown you, bishop e6 are other ways of defending the knight on d5. Ian plays 7 knight c3. Oftentimes, white will not place their knight on c3 so that they can later support d4 with pawn to c3. For instance, Ian could have simply castled, then Magnus would have filled in the fianchetto, Rook to e1, perhaps, castle, and 9c3, supporting the d4 pawn, is a simpler approach that leaves white with an advantage in space. However, Nepomniachtchi's style leans toward complex positions, so he played 7 knight c3. Jan added another attacker on d5, so Magnus adds another defender with 7 bishop e6. White castles, and then Magnus plays 8 knight to d7. And here Carlsen could have played bishop g7, creating a path to castling, but instead opts for the more complicated knight to d7. To which Jan responds with 9 queen f3. In this position, other strong players have preferred bishop takes d5 or knight takes d5, but Jan is content developing at the speed of Morphy. Magnus plays 9 bishop g7 and 10 rook e1. Jan has a pawn in the center, is castled, and has developed 5 pieces. Magnus, not so much. So Carlsen gets castled, and then Jan plays 11 queen g3 and immediately starts targeting the new location of Black's king. Alternatively, 11 bishop b3, knight c7, bishop g5, knight takes b3, ax b3, and knight e6, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, bishop e3, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, and rook a to d1 was how a sharp game between Angel Martin Gonzalez and Isaro Abreu Suarez continued in the Spanish Team Championship of 1994. If you want to see how that game finished, and it was an exciting one, remember you can see my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. But back to our feature game, where Jan has just played 11 queen g3, and Magnus responds with 11 knight takes e5. Being cramped and seeing his opponent with superior piece placement, Carlsen wisely decides to start trading pieces. 12 dx e5, 12 knight takes c3. With each trade of pieces, white's attacking chances evaporate more. 13 queen takes c3, bishop takes c4, 14 queen takes c4, and queen d5. Carlsen would be happy to trade queens as well. 15 queen e2. Nepomniachtchi, not so much. 15 rook a to d8, and we're now 15 moves in, and white has no advantage to speak of. 16 bishop g5 unifies his rooks and threatens the pawn on e7, to which Magnus responds 16 queen e6. Generally, it's not so great to use your queen to defend a pawn. However, here Magnus is also preparing to stack his rooks in the d-file, so this makes good sense. 17 queen e3. A very nice move which creates the queen and bishop battery that is oftentimes useful against a fianchetto, as well as, of course, threatening the a7 pawn. Finally, Ian's queen is now on an open rank, which gives it excellent scope. Magnus plays 17 b6 to avoid losing the pawn on a7. Of course, playing a6 is also important to consider. Had Magnus chosen 17 a6, Jan could have continued with queen b3, queen takes b3, ax b3, rook f to e8, bishop f4, rook d5, g3, rook e to d8, there's that stacking of the rooks in the d-file, rook a4, e6, and rook a to e4, which probably would lead to a draw, but black appears to be better as his rooks control the open file. His pieces are offensively placed, and black's pawn structure is slightly healthier. Probably would lead to a draw, but black appears to be better as his rooks control the open file, his pieces are offensively placed, and black's pawn structure is slightly healthier. But Carlsen chose 17 b6, 18 a4. And Jan immediately launches a pawn to undermine b6. Rook to d5. Magnus moves his rook to join in the attack on the e5 pawn. 19 bishop f4. So Nepo adds another defender. 19 queen f5. Adding another attacker makes sense, but also does plain rook f to d8 to form a battery. Let's see what that would have looked like. Had Magnus played 19 rook f d8, he's got a nice battery in the open d file. White could play h4, black could play h6, and then 21 a5, bx a5, queen c3, rook 8 to d7, rook takes a5, rook takes a5, queen takes a5, queen c4, g3, and queen takes c2. Looks good for black. But back to our feature game, where Magnus played 19 queen f5. 20 queen e4, and black's 20th move is queen to d7. This time Magnus chooses to avoid the trade of queens. Obviously, trading queens raises the probability of the game ending in a draw, but isn't a bad move per se. Had he gone forward with trading queens, then of course the rook's going to recapture, and then black could stack their rooks in the d file. But Magnus played 20 queen d7, to which Jan played 21 c3, guarding against rook to d4. 21 rook d8. So Magnus forms a super battery. 22 h3. Always wise to create an escape hatch when your opponent has rooks and a queen stacked in an open file. Black's 22nd move is queen e6. Magnus stops any dream of Jan's for playing pawn to e6. 23 queen e2. Jan eyes the a6 square with his queen. 23 rook d3, and Magnus immediately stops that idea as well. These kids are brilliant. 24 a5. With everything else stopped, Jan returns to his a5 idea. 24 b5. This certainly relieves the pressure. Black could have also allowed white to activate their rook and still been okay. It seems counterintuitive, but 24 h5, allowing white to play ax b6, getting a rook to the 7th rank, b5, bishop c1, rook 8 to d7, f4, rook takes a7, queen takes d3, and then rook a1 is dead even. But Magnus chose 24 b5. 25 a6. Jan makes Magnus's a7 pawn a permanent weakness. So black plays 25 c5 because Magnus realizes that white's a6 pawn is also a target, so he gives his queen access to it. 26 queen e4. This advance gives white's queen access to b7. 26 queen d5. Magnus blocks white's queen's path to b7, but there is a better way to do this. On d5, or if traded, black's queen is no longer a threat to white's weak pawn on a6. So, rook d8 to d5 is an improvement over what Magnus chose in the game. For instance, 28 rook 8 to d5, and play may have continued with something like rook a5, queen b6, rook a to e1, and e6, where black's position is preferable. But back to our feature game, where Magnus Carlsen chose 26 queen d5 as his method from stopping white's queen from gaining access to b7. 27 queen takes d5, so the queens trade off. Rook 3 takes d5, 28 rook to a5. Nepo immediately targets the weak pawn on b5. 28 c4, 29 king f1. Superb technique by the young Nepomniachtchi. King f1 sets up bishop to e3 because now the rook on e1 is defended, which is an important consideration when leaving black the option of playing rook takes e5. Magnus plays 29 e6, 30 bishop to e3, and black's 30th move is rook 8 to d7. Magnus wisely decides to guard the a7 pawn rather than take on e5, for if black loses a7, white's a6 pawn is a deep and dangerous pass pawn. 31 bishop d4. Jan's technique continues to amaze me, especially given his young age during this game. Now on d4, his bishop clogs Magnus's d-file, still threatens the weak a7 pawn, and is a second defender for the e5 pawn. Black's 31st move is bishop f8. Magnus moves his own bishop to where it sees more squares, but must be in shock that he is being outplayed by someone his age after the trade of queens. 32 rook to b1. Jan signals his intention to play b3 and then use both his rooks to threaten b5. Magnus will have to play very precisely. 32 bishop e7, 33 b3 as expected, and then 33 bishop to d8. This is inaccurate. Magnus wants to chase white's rook from a5, but as we will see, white's rook can relocate to a2 and still cause black problems. The key improvement for Magnus was spotting the bishop to b4 tactic. What is this bishop to b4 tactic I speak of? Well, better is bishop straight to b4. Looks like it's losing a bishop, but 33 bishop b4 would have been brilliant because after 34 cx b4, black could play rook takes d4, so it's a fair trade. After rook takes b5, c3. Now black's the one threatening bad things with a pass pawn. White must put a stop to that by putting a rook behind the pass pawn, rook c5, but then b4 falls, rook takes c3, king g7, king g1, h5, rook to a1, maybe rook b5, rook e3, rook b4, king to h2, locking white's king in with h4, rook to c1, rook to b6, to which white could create a threat of their own with rook c4. And it seems very likely that this would have concluded in a draw. But in his first game against Ian Nepomniachtchi, Magnus Carlsen played the mistake. 33 bishop d8. Rook to a2 as expected, and Magnus plays the surprising 34 rook takes d4. Carlsen realizes that white is threatening bxc4, and then with the capture back, rook to b7, and thus he has been outplayed. As such, he is willing to lose the exchange in desperation. Jan plays 35 cx d4, and then black plays 35 c3. Magnus advances his newly minted passed pawn. White plays 36 b4, but Jan's technique is perfect. By playing b4 here, white takes away black's ability to do the same and thus leaves black's c3 pawn vulnerable. 36 bishop g5. On g5, black's bishop is controlling the c1 queening square and also has access to d2. So Jan plays 37 rook d1, supporting his d4 pawn, and then black plays 37 rook c7, and now Magnus places a rook behind his pass pawn. 38 rook c2, but Jan calmly blockades it. 38 bishop e7, 39 d5. With c3 stopped, Jan can now return to playing offensively. 39 bishop takes b4, 40 d6, rook to c8, and 41 rook b1. Magnus resigns after being outplayed in his first game against Nepo. Really, there's not much Magnus could have done. He could have played rook c4 to defend the bishop, but then white's pawn can advance. Or he could have moved the bishop to safety, but then black loses the important b5 pawn. Maybe bishop b6, and then again d7,
the pawn advances. Rook d8. And here white can even play rook takes b6, ax b6, a7, rook takes d7, and then a8 turning into a queen, right? So it makes sense that Magnus resigned after 41 rook b1. This must have been a very troubling loss for young Magnus Carlsen in the under 12 section at the European Championship. And this was just the start for a pattern of Ian Nepomniachtchi finishing higher in prestigious youth tournaments than Magnus Carlsen. Of course, Magnus Carlsen goes on to become a world chess champion after taking the crown from Viswanathan Anand and has defended his title against higher-rated players than even Ian Nepomniachtchi. However, the outcome of matches isn't as dependent on ratings as it is on match-ups. And because of this, I believe this World Championship, the 2021 World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi, will be the biggest test yet. Magnus Carlsen.
And with that, I bid you adieu. My name is Chris Torres, and this has been my Daily Chess Musings. Don't forget to come back to see daily chess updates from the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi. Before you go, please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons.